What if an entire bloodline was whispered about, but never written down? What if the truth was so disturbing that even history chose to welcome to Story of the Black Past? A place where we uncover powerful and forgotten stories from history. Stories of mystery, hidden truths, and moments that challenge everything we think we know. If you are new here, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time you are watching this video. We always love to see how far our stories travel. If you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe and like this video. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful stories to life. Thank you for being here. Now relax, avoid all distractions and pay close attention. Watch until the very end, because the story you're about to hear is something you will not want to miss, even for a moment. Tonight, we travel into the remote mountain regions of Appalachia in the early 19th century, a place where distance created isolation, and isolation allowed stories to exist without ever being recorded. This is the story of a bloodline that people spoke about carefully, and often avoided completely. The names that remained were Nathaniel and Ruth, both 18, both bound by something deeper than ordinary connection. They lived in a part of the mountains where outsiders rarely came. Not because it was impossible to reach, but because people chose not to. That alone says something. Because places are not avoided without reason. And in those mountains, reason was rarely spoken out loud. At first, nothing about them seemed unusual. They worked, moved, lived quietly within their space. But over time, something began to stand out. Not in what they did, but in how people reacted to them. Neighbors kept distance, not openly, not in a way that created conflict, but in subtle ways. Avoided paths, shortened conversations, lingering silence, because something about that family carried a presence, a reputation that did not come from one event, but from something that had existed long before Nathaniel and Ruth were born. A bloodline, passed down, whispered about, but never fully explained, because some things are not written. They are remembered through caution, through behavior, through the quiet agreement to not look too closely. Nathaniel and Ruth grew within that awareness, not questioning it, not challenging it, but existing inside it, as if it were normal, as if it were simply the way things were. That is what made it more unsettling, because what others feared, they accepted. What others avoided, they lived within. And that difference created distance, not just physically, but in understanding. People began to notice patterns, not clear ones, not easily defined, but enough to create unease. Livestock missing, strange sounds at night, moments where something felt wrong without a clear cause. And in those moments, thoughts returned to the same place. That family, that bloodline. But nothing was ever proven, nothing was ever seen clearly enough to confirm, and that uncertainty is what made it powerful. Because what cannot be proven cannot be confronted. It can only be avoided, and avoidance became the unspoken rule. Nathaniel and Ruth remained unchanged, calm, quiet, unbothered by the distance others kept, because they had never known anything different. Their reality was not shaped by fear. It was shaped by familiarity, and familiarity removes questioning. As this story begins to unfold further, one truth becomes clear. This was never about one moment. It was about something that had existed for generations, something carried, something inherited, something that people felt but could never fully explain. And once something like that exists, it does not disappear. It continues, quietly, through time, through memory, through those who carry it forward. The distance between that family and the rest of the people in Appalachia did not happen all at once. It grew, slowly, quietly, until it became normal, because that is how separation forms, not through one event, but through repeated moments that create a pattern. And patterns, over time, become accepted. The older people in the region remembered things differently, not clearly, not with full detail, but enough to feel that something had always been wrong. They spoke less about it as time passed, not because it was forgotten, but because it was understood without needing words, a kind of silence that carries meaning. Nathaniel and Ruth lived within that silence, not questioning it, not resisting it, but existing as if it were simply part of life. And that is what made everything feel deeper, because they did not react to the distance. They did not try to change it. They accepted it, as if they knew something others did not. as if they understood the reason behind it. Even if it was never spoken, the patterns around them continued. Small things, unexplained things, moments that did not fully make sense, but never enough to create certainty. Only enough to create suspicion, and suspicion without proof becomes something else. It becomes belief, a quiet belief that shapes behavior, that tells people where not to go, who not to trust, what not to question too closely, because questioning too deeply risked discovering something that cannot be undone. And that is what people avoided. Not danger alone, but knowledge. Because knowledge, once gained, cannot be taken back. Nathaniel began to move more independently as time passed, not in a way that drew attention, but in a way that extended his presence beyond the immediate space. And each time he appeared outside what people considered normal, something followed. A feeling, not fear exactly, but awareness. A sense that something was not fully understood. Ruth remained closer, more still, more contained. But her presence carried its own weight, because stillness, when it is too consistent, becomes noticeable. It creates a contrast, a difference that people feel, even if they cannot explain it. The land itself seemed to reflect that difference, not visibly, but in how it was experienced. Certain areas felt heavier, quieter, as if something within them had settled over time, and those areas were always near where that family lived, always within reach of their presence, and that connection, even without proof, became accepted, not spoken, but known. As this story continues, one truth becomes clearer. This was not about one act, or one moment. It was about continuity, something passed down, something that did not need to be explained to exist, because its presence was enough, its effect was enough, and once something like that exists across generations, it becomes part of the place itself. Part of how it is experienced, part of how it is understood, even if it is never fully revealed. And that is what made it impossible to remove. Because it was no longer separate, it had become part of everything around it. Quietly, deeply, and completely. And as time continued to pass in the quiet mountains of Appalachia, the line between what was known and what was only felt became harder to separate, because the longer something exists without being explained, the more it becomes accepted, not as truth, but as reality. The people who lived near Nathaniel and Ruth stopped asking questions, not because they no longer wondered, but because wondering led nowhere. There were no answers, only more uncertainty, and uncertainty, when it lasts long enough, becomes something people learn to live around, not confront, not resolve, but avoid. The paths near their home became quieter, less traveled, not marked, but understood, because people do not need signs when experience teaches them where not to go. Nathaniel continued to move between spaces, appearing where he was not expected, leaving without explanation, and each time the same feeling followed, a slight disruption, a shift in how things were experienced, as if his presence carried something unseen, something that altered the space around him, not visibly, but perceptibly. Ruth remained closer to their home, but her stillness became something people noticed more over time, not because she did anything, but because she did not. Because stillness, when it remains unchanged for too long, begins to feel unnatural. It stands out, it creates questions, and in a place where questions had no answers, that made it heavier. The older generation began to fade, taking with them whatever fragments of understanding they once held, and with them, the possibility of explanation faded as well. What remained was not knowledge, but impression, a lingering sense that something had always been there, something that did not begin with Nathaniel and Ruth, and would not end with them. That is the nature of something carried through a bloodline. It does not rely on memory, it relies on continuation, on presence, on the quiet transfer of something that does not need to be named to exist. The younger generation did not know the origin, they did not know the beginning, but they felt the effect, and that was enough, because effect shapes behavior more than explanation ever could. As this story moves toward its final reflection, one truth becomes unavoidable. This was never about proving anything. It was about experiencing something that could not be fully understood, something that existed outside of explanation, outside of logic, but still within reality, because reality is not always what can be defined. Sometimes it is simply what is felt, and what was felt in those mountains remained. Quiet, unchanged, persistent, a presence that did not demand attention, but could not be ignored, and once something like that becomes part of a place, it does not leave. It settles. It stays. It becomes part of everything around it, and that is where this story rests, not in answers, but in that presence. A presence that continues, quietly, endlessly, and completely. Because once something becomes part of reality itself, it cannot be separated from it. It simply remains, and even now, after everything has settled into silence, there is still one final understanding that remains, because what existed in those mountains of Appalachia was never something that could be fully explained. It was something that was lived, experienced, felt across time without ever being clearly defined. Nathaniel and Ruth were not the beginning, and they were not the end. They were part of a continuation, a line that moved forward quietly, without needing to be recorded, without needing to be understood, because some things do not survive through explanation. They survive through presence, through the way they shape the space around them, through the way people respond to them, without always knowing why. That is what remained, not a story that could be told clearly, but a pattern that could be felt. A quiet understanding passed down without words. The mountains held it, the people carried it, and over time, it became part of the place itself, not separate, not noticeable at every moment, but always there, like something just beneath the surface, something that does not reveal itself fully, but never disappears. As generations passed, the details faded, names became less important, events became unclear, but the feeling remained, that sense that something existed beyond what could be seen, something tied to that land, to that bloodline, to a presence that never fully left, and that is what gives it weight. Because what cannot be fully understood cannot be fully dismissed. It stays in the mind, in the awareness, in the quiet moments. Quiet, where something feels slightly different, only something to recognize. That not all history is written, not all truths are recorded, and not all things that exist can be explained. Some are simply experienced, and once they are experienced, they become part of how reality is understood. That is where this story rests. Not in proof, not in conclusion, but in presence. A quiet, lasting presence that continues, through time, through memory, through the spaces where understanding does not fully reach, and once something exists in that way, it never truly ends. It remains, waiting. For the next moment it will be felt again, and when it is, just like before, everything will feel slightly different, and that difference will be enough to remind you that some things were never meant to be fully known, only acknowledged, and once acknowledged, they stay, quietly, endlessly, and completely. And even now, beyond everything that has been told, there is still one final silence that remains, because what lingered in those mountains of Appalachia was never something that needed to be seen clearly to exist. It was something that stayed just beyond full understanding. Close enough to be felt, but never close enough to be fully explained, and that distance is what gave it power, because when something cannot be fully understood, it cannot be fully dismissed. It remains. In thought, in memory, in the quiet awareness that something is there. Even when nothing can be proven, Nathaniel and Ruth became part of that awareness, not as individuals alone, but as symbols of something that continued beyond them, something that had no clear beginning, and no clear end. Because it did not rely on time, it relied on presence, and presence, once established deeply enough, does not fade. It settles into the environment, into the way a place feels, into the way people respond without knowing why. That is what remained. Not a clear story, not a defined truth, but a lasting impression, one that shaped behavior, shaped distance, shaped the quiet decisions people made without ever speaking them aloud. As this story reaches its final continuation, there is nothing more to explain, only something to carry with you, that not everything that exists can be fully understood, that some things remain just outside explanation, not because they are impossible, but because they are beyond the way we try to define them. And once something exists in that space, it becomes part of everything, part of how we see, part of how we think, part of how we experience the world. That is where this story truly rests. Not in the past, but in that awareness. A quiet awareness that continues, waiting. For the next moment, it will be felt again, and when it is, just like before, everything will seem slightly different, and you will understand that some things were never meant to be fully known, only recognized, and once recognized, they remain, quietly, endlessly, and completely. And even now, after everything has been carried into silence, there is still one final understanding that remains, because what existed in those mountains of Appalachia was never something that needed a beginning or an ending. It simply was. And things that exist in that way do not follow the rules people expect. They are not measured by time. They are not limited by explanation. They continue, quietly, through presence alone. Nathaniel and Ruth were part of that presence, not as a starting point, not as a conclusion, but as a continuation, a moment within something larger, something that had already been there, and would remain long after, because what people felt around them was not tied to one event. It was tied to something deeper, something that moved through generations without needing to be understood. That is what made it lasting. Because what is understood can be explained, and what is explained can be reduced, but what is only felt cannot be reduced. It stays, whole, unchanged, persistent. The mountains held it, the people carried it, and over time it became part of the space itself. Not separate, not noticeable at every moment, but always present, like something just beneath awareness, something that reveals itself only in certain moments, when attention shifts, when perception opens, when something feels slightly different. As this story reaches its final reflection, there is nothing more to uncover, only something to recognize, that not all things are meant to be fully understood, that some things exist simply as part of reality, unexplained, unresolved, but undeniable. And once something is recognized in that way, it does not disappear. It becomes part of how everything else is experienced. That is where this story rests. Not in answers, not in proof, but in presence. A quiet, lasting presence that continues, through time, through awareness, through the subtle moments where something feels just slightly out of place. And when those moments come, just like before, something inside will recognize it. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. Enough to know that it is there, and that it has always been there, and that it will remain, quietly, endlessly, and completely. And even now, after every word has faded into quiet, there is still something that remains, because what lived within those mountains of Appalachia was never something that depended on being told. It did not need a voice. It did not need a record. It only needed to exist, and it did. Through time, through people, through the spaces where understanding could not fully reach. Nathaniel and Ruth were only a part of that. A visible point in something that was mostly unseen, because what surrounded them was not defined by actions alone. It was defined by presence, by the way things felt without explanation, by the quiet shifts that could not be traced to a single cause. And that is what made it endure, because what cannot be fully explained cannot be fully removed. It remains, not as something you can point to, but as something you recognize, a feeling, a subtle awareness, a moment where everything seems normal, yet something is slightly different. That difference is where it lives. Not in what is obvious, but in what is just beyond it. The people who came after may not have known the names. They may not have known the details, but they carried the same awareness, the same quiet understanding that something existed there, something that did not follow the usual rules. And that awareness shaped how they moved, how they chose where to go, what to avoid, what to leave undisturbed. Because some things are not meant to be uncovered, not because they cannot be, but because uncovering them changes something. Irreversibly. As this story reaches its final continuation, there is nothing more to add. Only something to leave with you, that not all truths are meant to be brought fully into light. Some exist in the space between knowing and not knowing, and that space has its own kind of power, a quiet power, one that does not force itself to be seen, but remains, waiting, For the moments when perception shifts just enough to notice it again. That is where this story lives now, not in the past, but in that awareness. An awareness that continues, quietly, endlessly, and completely. And once it is felt, even for a moment, it never fully leaves. It stays, just beneath the surface, reminding you that some things were never meant to be fully understood, only sensed. And once sensed, they remain. Forever. And even now, after everything has been carried into stillness, there is still one final truth that remains, because what lingered in those mountains of Appalachia was never something that needed to be discovered. It was something that revealed itself only when it chose to. In small ways, in quiet moments, in that brief feeling when everything seems normal, yet not completely. That is where it lives. Not in full understanding, but in that slight difference. That subtle shift that cannot be explained. Nathaniel and Ruth became part of that shift. Not because of what they did, but because of what they carried, something that moved through them, something that continued beyond them, something that did not rely on memory or record, because it did not need to be remembered, it only needed to remain, and it did. Through time, through silence, through the way people felt something they could not fully name. That is what makes something truly lasting. Not visibility, not recognition, but persistence. The kind that does not fade even when everything else changes. As generations passed, the mountains remained, the land unchanged in its form, but not in its presence, because presence is shaped by what has passed, through it, by what has settled into it, by what has never fully left, and something there never left. It became part of the space, part of the feeling, part of the quiet awareness that certain places hold more than what can be seen. As this story reaches its final breath, there is nothing more to uncover. Only something to accept, that not all things are meant to be explained, that some things exist simply because they do, and that their existence does not depend on our understanding of them. Nathaniel and Ruth are no longer just names. They are part of that awareness, part of that quiet, lingering presence, and that is where this story truly rests. Not in answers, not in conclusions, but in that presence, a presence that continues, waiting for the next moment it will be felt again. And when it is, just like before, something inside will recognize it. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. Enough to know that it is there, that it has always been there, and that it will remain quietly, endlessly, and completely.